The sound of rotor blades cutting through the humid jungle air should have been reassuring, but for Captain Maria Santos, sitting in what her fellow pilots mockingly called a toy helicopter, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump only reminded her of how small, how vulnerable, and how utterly inadequate her aircraft seemed for the mission ahead. The Hughes OH-6A Cayuse, affectionately known as the Loach, was barely 14 feet long and weighed less than a compact car. Compared to the massive Huey helicopters that dominated the Vietnam War landscape, Maria's bird looked like a child's remote-controlled toy that had somehow wandered onto a real battlefield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was March 15th, 1971, deep in the mountains of South Vietnam, where the dense canopy created a green ceiling that seemed to press down on everything below. Maria had been flying for the 1st Cavalry Division for 8 months, but today felt different. The radio crackled with urgent voices, coordinates being shouted over static, and the kind of desperate tone that every pilot recognized. Soldiers were trapped, wounded, and running out of time. The mission briefing had been brutal in its simplicity. An entire platoon, 34 men, had walked into an ambush in a valley so narrow and so heavily forested that the standard Huey medevac helicopters couldn't get in. The landing zones were too small, the trees too thick, and the enemy fire too intense. Command had tried twice already, sending in their biggest, most heavily armed birds, but both attempts had failed. The Hueys were simply too large, too loud, and too obvious. They were sitting ducks in that confined space. That's when someone remembered the tiny observation helicopter sitting on the tarmac, the one that most pilots treated like a curiosity rather than a serious aircraft. The OH-6A wasn't designed for medevac operations. It was built for reconnaissance, for darting in and out of dangerous areas to gather intelligence, not for carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Its cabin was so small that it could barely fit 2 people, let alone injured men with stretchers and medical equipment. Maria Santos wasn't supposed to be flying that day. She'd been grounded for 3 days with a minor injury from a hard landing during her last mission. But when the call came in, when command realized they needed someone crazy enough or desperate enough to attempt the impossible, her name was the first they thought of. She'd earned a reputation as the pilot who would fly anywhere, anytime, no matter how dangerous or unlikely the mission seemed. Standing barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair always pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that seemed to see everything at once, Maria looked nothing like the stereotypical military pilot. The other aviators had initially dismissed her, assuming she was just another example of the military's experiments with female personnel, but that assumption lasted exactly as long as it took to see her fly. Maria didn't just pilot her helicopter, she became one with it, reading the wind patterns, feeling the engine's vibrations through her bones, and navigating spaces that seemed impossible for any aircraft to enter. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Maria had been reviewing maintenance reports, checking weather patterns, and preparing for what she assumed would be a routine reconnaissance flight. The OH-6A sat on the flight line, its bubble canopy gleaming in the early morning sun, its small rotor system looking almost delicate compared to the massive blades of the Hueys parked nearby. She'd named her helicopter Hummingbird, partly because of its size and agility, but mostly because, like the tiny birds, it could hover in places that seemed impossible and move in ways that defied logic. The emergency call came in at 0847 hours. The voice on the radio was tight with controlled panic, the kind of professional calm that barely masked genuine terror. "We need immediate medevac for multiple casualties. Standard birds can't get in. Repeat, Standard medevac cannot access the LZ. We're looking at alternatives. Maria was already moving toward her helicopter before the transmission ended. She knew what alternatives meant. They needed someone willing to fly into a space where no sensible pilot would go, someone whose aircraft was small enough to thread the needle between trees and hills, and someone foolish enough to believe it could actually work. The intelligence briefing was grim. The trapped platoon had been conducting a search-and-destroy mission in a valley that intelligence had assured them was clear of enemy activity. It wasn't. The North Vietnamese army had been waiting, had set up an elaborate ambush that turned the narrow valley into a killing field. The American soldiers had taken cover wherever they could find it, but they were pinned down by crossfire from elevated positions on both sides of the valley. Worse, the jungle canopy was so thick that it created natural camouflage for enemy positions, while making it nearly impossible for American aircraft to provide effective support. The Huey pilots had tried to hover just above the treetops, but the combination of enemy fire and the confined space made it suicide. One Huey had taken multiple hits and barely made it back to base. Another had been forced to abort when tree branches damaged its tail rotor. The wounded soldiers had been calling for medevac for 6 hours. 6 hours of bleeding, of fighting infection in the humid jungle environment, of watching their ammunition run low while enemy positions seemed to multiply around them. Command estimated they had maybe 2 hours before the situation became completely untenable, before the North Vietnamese forces moved in for what would certainly be a massacre. Maria studied the aerial photographs, the topographic maps, and the radio intercepts that intelligence had managed to gather. The landing zone wasn't really a landing zone. It was a small clearing barely 30 feet in diameter, surrounded on all sides by trees that rose over 100 feet into the air. Getting in would require descending through a natural chimney of branches and leaves with no room for error and no possibility of a quick escape if things went wrong. The flight to the combat zone took 23 minutes, but it felt like hours. Maria flew the Hummingbird low and fast, using every terrain feature to mask her approach. The OH-6A's small size, which had seemed like such a disadvantage on paper, suddenly became its greatest asset. She could fly between hills that would force larger helicopters to go around, could duck under radar coverage that would detect bigger aircraft, and could follow flight paths that were simply impossible for anything else in the American inventory. As she approached the valley, the sound of gunfire became audible even over the rotor noise. It wasn't the sporadic pop-pop-pop of small arms fire that characterized most skirmishes, but the sustained, rhythmic hammering of a full-scale firefight. Tracer rounds were visible even in daylight, creating deadly streams of light that crisscrossed the narrow valley like some lethal laser show. Maria's radio crackled to life. "Hummingbird, this is Ground Zero Actual. We have visual on your approach. Be advised, the LZ is extremely hot. We're taking fire from multiple positions. The wounded are staged approximately 50 meters north of the clearing, but we can't move them without drawing concentrated fire." She keyed her microphone. "Ground Zero Actual, Hummingbird copies. I'm going to need you to mark your positions with smoke, but don't pop it until I'm directly overhead. I don't want to give Charlie any more warning than necessary." "Roger, Hummingbird. Be advised we have 34 casualties total, 17 priority, 12 urgent, 5 routine. We've been trying to stabilize the critical cases, but we're running low on medical supplies." 34 casualties. Maria did the math in her head. Her helicopter could carry, at most, 2 wounded soldiers per trip, and that was if they weren't on stretchers. If she had to transport men who couldn't sit upright, she'd be looking at 1 casualty per flight. 34 trips into a hot landing zone, with enemy forces watching every approach, learning her patterns, adjusting their fire with each attempt. She began her descent toward the valley, the Hummingbird dropping through layers of humid air that seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive with each foot of altitude lost. The jungle canopy rushed up toward her, individual trees becoming visible, then individual branches, then individual leaves. At 100 feet above the treetops, she could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions, bright sparks of light that appeared and disappeared among the green shadows. The clearing, when she finally spotted it, looked even smaller than the aerial photographs had suggested. It was roughly circular, with stumps and fallen logs scattered across uneven ground that would make landing treacherous even under ideal conditions. Tall trees pressed in from all sides, their branches reaching toward each other like gnarled fingers trying to close the gap. Getting down into that space would require precision that bordered on the impossible. Getting back out, especially while carrying wounded soldiers, would be even worse. Ground Zero Actual, Hummingbird, I'm beginning my approach. Pop smoke on my mark. Roger, Hummingbird, stand by. Maria took a deep breath and pushed the cyclic forward, beginning her descent into what every rational part of her mind recognized as a carefully constructed trap. The Hummingbird dropped through the canopy like a stone, branches scraping against the landing skids, leaves and small twigs being chopped into confetti by the rotor blades. The sound was incredible. A combination of the engine at full power, the rotors beating against humid air, and the constant scratching and snapping of vegetation being destroyed by her passage. At 50 feet above the clearing, the first shots rang out. Maria could hear the distinctive crack thump of AK-47 rounds passing close to her aircraft, could see tracer rounds flashing past the bubble canopy like deadly fireflies. She held the helicopter in a tight auto-rotation, using gravity and rotor momentum to control her descent while keeping engine power in reserve for the critical moment when she'd need to arrest her fall and settle onto the uneven ground. "Mark, Mark, Mark," she called into her radio. Purple smoke began billowing up from the northern edge of the clearing, quickly spreading into a haze that provided some concealment but also made it harder to judge distances and obstacles. Maria could see soldiers moving through the smoke, carrying stretchers, dragging wounded comrades toward what they hoped would be salvation in the form of her tiny helicopter. The landing was more controlled crash than graceful touchdown. The Hummingbird hit the ground hard, bounced once, settled again with a grinding noise from the landing gear, and immediately began taking on passengers. 2 soldiers appeared at the aircraft doors before Maria had even completed her post-landing checks, a medic and a sergeant who began loading the most critically wounded man they had. "This is Gonzalez. Chest wound, possible punctured lung, losing blood fast. He needs a trauma center now." The wounded soldier was barely conscious, his uniform soaked with blood that looked black in the strange light filtering through the jungle canopy. The medic and sergeant worked with the efficiency of men who had done this too many times, securing the casualty in the cramped cabin space while Maria kept the rotor spinning and one eye on the surrounding tree line where muzzle flashes continued to wink like malevolent stars. "We've got room for one more," she called to the medic. "Who's next priority?" "Johnson, leg wound, possible arterial damage." Another soldier was loaded into the remaining space, this one conscious but pale from blood loss and shock. The cabin was now packed to capacity with wounded men, medical equipment, and the medic who had volunteered to ride along to keep the casualties stable during the flight to the field hospital. The takeoff from the clearing was the most terrifying experience of Maria's flying career, and she'd already survived more than her share of terrifying experiences. The Hummingbird, now overloaded with passengers and running on fumes from the extra power needed for the vertical descent, struggled to gain altitude. The enemy, having had time to adjust their fire and anticipate her departure, had concentrated their weapons on the narrow chimney of open air that represented her only escape route. Maria pulled pitch with everything the helicopter had, feeling the aircraft shudder as it fought against gravity, the weight of its passengers, and the limited power available from its small turbine engine. Tracer rounds streaked past the canopy, some so close she could feel the heat through the plexiglass. One round punched through the tail boom with a metallic ping that she felt more than heard, but the helicopter continued to climb. The ascent through the tree canopy was a nightmare of green shadows, scraping branches, and the constant possibility of catching a rotor blade on something solid enough to bring them all crashing down into the jungle floor. Maria flew by instinct more than sight, feeling her way upward through openings that seemed to close around her as she passed, trusting the helicopter's responses to tell her where the obstacles were and how much room she had to maneuver. When they finally broke through the top of the canopy into clear air and sunlight, Maria felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. But the relief lasted only seconds. She had 32 more casualties waiting in that clearing, and the enemy now knew exactly what she was doing and exactly how she was doing it. They would be ready for her return. The flight to the field hospital took 8 minutes at full throttle, the Hummingbird racing across the landscape at treetop level while the medic worked frantically to keep the 2 wounded soldiers alive. The chest wound case, Gonzalez, had developed complications during the flight, his breathing becoming labored and his pulse growing weaker. The medic was performing chest compressions in the cramped cabin space, his voice steady but urgent as he called out medical information that Maria relayed to the hospital via radio. The field hospital landing pad was a scene of controlled chaos. Medical personnel were already waiting with gurneys and equipment, having been alerted by radio about the incoming casualties. As soon as the Hummingbird touched down, the wounded soldiers were transferred to the trauma teams and rushed into surgery. Maria didn't even shut down the engine. There wasn't time. "How many more?" asked the flight surgeon who came out to brief her on the casualties' conditions. 32, Maria replied, already running through her pre-flight checks for the return trip. 17 more priority cases. The surgeon looked at her small helicopter, then back at her face. "In that bird? How long is that going to take?" "As long as it takes," Maria said simply. "They're Americans, and they're counting on us." The return flight to the valley seemed shorter, partly because Maria now knew the route and the timing, but mostly because she was focused entirely on the mission ahead. Each trip would be more dangerous than the last, as the enemy learned her patterns and adjusted their tactics. They would have moved weapons to cover her landing zone more effectively, would have registered ranges and firing solutions for the approaches she'd used. By the 5th or 6th trip, they'd have the clearing zeroed in so precisely that landing would be nearly suicidal. But that was a problem for later. Right now, she had a second trip to complete. The descent into the clearing the second time was even more harrowing than the first. The enemy fire began while she was still above the canopy, forcing her to take evasive action that threatened to send her crashing into the surrounding trees. Rounds punched through the aircraft skin in multiple places. She could hear them hitting, could smell the distinctive odor of hydraulic fluid leaking from damaged lines. The soldiers on the ground had learned from the first evacuation, having moved the wounded closer to the landing zone and organized them by priority. The moment Maria touched down, 2 more casualties were loaded aboard, another chest wound and a soldier with massive trauma to his left arm that had nearly been severed by shrapnel. This time, the takeoff was even more difficult. The aircraft had sustained damage that was affecting its performance, and the enemy fire was more concentrated and accurate. Maria felt the aircraft take multiple hits during the climb-out, including one that starred the bubble canopy just inches from her head. But they made it clear of the canopy, made it to the hospital, delivered 2 more wounded soldiers to the trauma teams. 30 left to go. The third trip revealed the extent of the damage her helicopter had sustained. The engine was running rough, probably from debris ingested during her passage through the canopy. The hydraulic system was compromised, making the controls heavy and unresponsive. One of the radio sets had been knocked out by enemy fire, limiting her communications. And fuel consumption was higher than normal, meaning she'd need to carefully calculate whether she had enough gas for each round trip. But the helicopter was still flying, still capable of reaching the trapped soldiers and bringing them out. As long as the Hummingbird would fly, Maria would keep going back. The third evacuation brought out 2 more priority casualties, including a young soldier who couldn't have been older than 19, his face pale with shock, but his eyes clear and alert. "Thank you," he whispered as the medics loaded him into the helicopter. "Thank you for coming back." 28 to go. By the 4th trip back to the valley, word had spread throughout the entire combat zone about what Maria Santos was attempting. Radio chatter from other units revealed a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and concern that bordered on panic from higher command levels. No one had ever attempted this many evacuation runs from a hot landing zone, especially not in an aircraft that was never designed for medevac operations. "Hummingbird, this is dust-off operations," came a new voice over the radio as Maria prepared for her 4th descent into the valley. "We're tracking your mission status. Be advised that we have Huey gunships en route to provide covering fire for your operations." Maria keyed her microphone, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion that was beginning to creep into her bones. "Dust-off operations, negative on the gunship support. The LZ is too confined for effective covering fire, and the enemy positions are too close to our wounded. Gunship fire would endanger our own people." "Roger, Hummingbird. Understand your position. but be advised that intel indicates enemy reinforcements moving toward your AO. Time is critical. Enemy reinforcements. Maria had been expecting this development, but hearing it confirmed added a new layer of urgency to an already desperate situation. The North Vietnamese commanders weren't stupid. They knew what she was doing, and they would be moving additional troops and weapons into position to stop her. Each trip into the valley was not just more dangerous than the last, it was potentially the trip that would end in disaster for everyone involved. The fourth descent revealed how quickly the tactical situation was deteriorating. The enemy fire was now coming from positions that hadn't been active during her first 3 trips, indicating that fresh troops with additional weapons had indeed moved into the area. Worse, the fire was more coordinated, with multiple weapons concentrating on her helicopter simultaneously, instead of the random, scattered shooting she had encountered initially. The Hummingbird took more hits on this approach than on all the previous trips combined. Maria could hear rounds punching through the aircraft's skin, could feel the helicopter's responses becoming more sluggish as systems were damaged or destroyed. The engine temperature was climbing into the red zone, and she was beginning to get warning lights of her instrument panel that indicated critical systems were failing. But the helicopter was still flying, still responding to her controls, still capable of reaching the wounded soldiers who were counting on her return. The casualties loaded during the 4th trip included a soldier with a head wound that had left him barely conscious, and a medic who had been wounded while treating other casualties. The medic, despite his own injuries, continued working on his unconscious patient throughout the flight to the field hospital, his hands steady, even as blood from his own wounds dripped onto the medical supplies he was using. "How many more trips can you make?" the flight surgeon asked during the brief moment while casualties were being transferred to the trauma teams. Maria looked at her helicopter, counting the bullet holes visible in the fuselage, noting the fluid leaks that were creating dark stains on the landing pad beneath her aircraft. "As many as it takes," she replied, but for the first time, she wasn't certain that would be enough. The Hummingbird was hurt, badly, and each additional trip was pushing both pilot and machine closer to the point of total failure. 26 casualties left to evacuate. The 5th trip almost ended in disaster before it began. During the takeoff from the field hospital, the helicopter's engine coughed, hesitated, then resumed normal operation with a grinding noise that hadn't been there before. Maria felt the aircraft yaw unexpectedly during the initial climb, indicating possible damage to the tail rotor system that could make the helicopter uncontrollable without warning. She considered aborting the mission, declaring her aircraft unfit for flight, and waiting for another pilot in another helicopter to continue the evacuations. It would have been the sensible, the safe decision, the decision that would have kept her alive to fly again another day, but it would also mean leaving 26 wounded soldiers in that valley for an unknown period of time while arrangements were made for alternative evacuation methods. Maria kept flying. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The approach to the clearing during the 5th trip revealed that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The enemy forces had repositioned their weapons to create a killing field that covered every possible approach to the landing zone. Tracers filled the air like deadly fireworks, and the sound of incoming rounds was now constant rather than intermittent. The soldiers on the ground were pinned down behind whatever cover they could find, unable to move the wounded to the landing zone without exposing them to concentrated fire. Maria realized she would need to modify her approach, using the damaged buildings and terrain features to mask her descent until the very last moment. She began a spiral approach, staying behind a ridgeline until she was directly over the clearing, then dropping into it like a stone while the enemy gunners tried to track her movement and adjust their fire. The landing was hard enough to crack her teeth together, but the Hummingbird held together. 2 more priority casualties were loaded aboard, including a soldier with burns covering over 60% of his body and another with multiple gunshot wounds to the torso. Both men were unconscious, kept alive only by the skilled medical attention of the remaining medics, who were themselves running dangerously low on supplies. The takeoff from the clearing during the 5th trip was when Maria first realized just how badly damaged her helicopter had become.
The engine was overheating to the point where she could smell burning oil and metal through the ventilation system. The hydraulic system had failed completely, leaving her to control the aircraft through physical strength alone. And the tail rotor was making noises that indicated bearing failure, a condition that could result in complete loss of control without any warning. But they made it out of the valley, made it to the field hospital, delivered 2 more wounded soldiers to the trauma teams. 24 left to evacuate, and Maria wasn't sure her helicopter would survive another trip.
The field hospital maintenance chief took one look at Maria's helicopter after the 5th evacuation and shook his head. "Ma'am, I can't in good conscience clear this bird for another flight. You've got engine problems, hydraulic failure, tail rotor bearing damage, and more bullet holes than I can count. This aircraft needs to be grounded for major repairs." Maria studied the damage assessment, seeing her own fears confirmed in the maintenance logs. The Hummingbird was hurt badly, operating on backup systems and pilot skill more than mechanical reliability. Any reasonable evaluation would conclude that continuing flight operations would be suicidal for the pilot and fatal for any casualties being transported. "How long for repairs?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Minimum 8 hours for the critical items, probably 12 to 16 for a complete restoration to flight-worthy status. And that's if we have all the parts, which we don't." 16 hours. In 16 hours, the 24 soldiers still trapped in that valley would likely be dead, either from their wounds, from lack of medical supplies, or from being overrun by the enemy forces that intelligence reported were moving into the area. Waiting for repairs wasn't an option. "What if we just fix the absolutely critical items?" Maria asked. "What's the minimum work needed to keep her flying for a few more hours?" The maintenance chief considered this, his expression grim. "I can patch the hydraulic leaks temporarily, maybe get you partial power assistance back. I can jerry-rig the engine cooling system to buy you some time before it overheats completely. But the tail rotor bearings, there's nothing I can do about that without pulling the entire assembly. If those bearings fail completely during flight, you'll lose all anti-torque control. The aircraft will spin like a top and crash." "How long before that happens?" "Could be the next flight, could be 10 more flights. There's no way to predict bearing failure once they start making noise." Maria looked at her damaged helicopter, then at the trauma teams working on the casualties she'd already evacuated, then at the radio that would soon bring word from the soldiers still trapped in the valley. 24 men counting on her return, counting on her tiny, damaged helicopter to carry them to safety. "Start the patches," she told the maintenance chief. "Do what you can in 30 minutes, then I'm going back." The 6th trip began with an engine that ran slightly smoother thanks to the emergency repairs, but the tail rotor noise had gotten worse during the brief maintenance period. Maria could feel the helicopter wanting to yaw unexpectedly during hover operations, requiring constant pedal inputs to maintain directional control. Each flight now was not just a test of her flying skills, but a gamble with mechanical systems that could fail catastrophically at any moment. The tactical situation in the valley had continued to deteriorate during her brief absence. Enemy forces had moved closer to the American positions, and the volume of incoming fire had increased to the point where the trapped soldiers were barely able to return effective fire. The radio calls from the ground were becoming more desperate, with reports of ammunition running low and several wounded soldiers whose conditions were deteriorating rapidly. "Hummingbird, ground zero actual," came the call, as Maria began her 6th approach to the clearing. "Be advised, we have multiple critical casualties that won't survive much longer without immediate evacuation. We're going to have to risk moving them to the LZ despite the enemy fire." "Negative, ground zero. Keep your people in cover. I'll get as close as I can to your positions." Maria modified her approach once again, this time bringing the helicopter down in a different corner of the clearing, closer to where the most critically wounded soldiers had taken cover. The enemy fire was so intense that she could see bark flying from trees as bullets struck all around her aircraft, and the sound of rounds hitting the Hummingbird was now constant rather than occasional. The soldiers who loaded casualties during the 6th trip moved with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they were racing against time. 2 more priority cases, one with a chest wound similar to the first casualty she evacuated, and another with massive trauma to both legs.
Both men were unconscious, their conditions so critical that the medics weren't sure they would survive the flight to the hospital. The takeoff during the sixth tip was when Maria first felt the tail rotor bearing begin to seize. There was a grinding noise that she could feel through the airframe, followed by a moment of complete loss of anti-torque control that sent the helicopter spinning nearly 90 degrees before she could compensate. Only her experience and lightning-fast reflexes prevented the aircraft from spinning into the trees and crashing with all hands. But they made it out, made it to the hospital, delivered 2 more wounded soldiers to the trauma teams. 22 left, and Maria wasn't sure the helicopter would survive the approach to the valley, let alone another takeoff.
The maintenance chief was waiting for her when she landed after the 6th evacuation, his face grim with the knowledge of what the aircraft damage reports were telling him. "Captain, I'm sorry, but I have to ground this aircraft. The tail rotor situation is critical. You nearly lost control during that last takeoff, and it's only going to get worse." Maria shut down the engine and sat in the pilot's seat for a moment, listening to the sound of cooling metal and leaking fluids dripping onto the landing pad. She knew the maintenance chief was right. She knew that attempting another flight in the Hummingbird's current condition was not bravery, but recklessness that could result in the deaths of everyone aboard. But she also knew that 22 soldiers were still trapped in that valley, still counting on her return, still believing that their tiny guardian angel would keep coming back until every last man had been brought to safety. "Give me 5 minutes," she told the maintenance chief. "Let me talk to command." The radio call to headquarters was brief and to the point. Maria explained the tactical situation, the mechanical condition of her aircraft, and the impossible choice she was facing. Continue flying in a helicopter that could fail catastrophically at any moment, or abandon 22 wounded soldiers to their fate while waiting for alternative evacuation methods that might never come. "Hummingbird, this is Colonel Morrison, Division Aviation Officer. Captain Santos, you've already done more than anyone could have asked of you. You've evacuated 12 casualties from an impossible situation. No one would fault you for standing down at this point. Sir, with respect, I didn't take an oath to do what was reasonable or safe. I took an oath to leave no one behind. There are 22 Americans still in that valley, and as long as this helicopter will fly, I'm going back for them." There was a long pause on the radio. When Colonel Morrison's voice returned, it carried a tone of resignation mixed with admiration. "Roger, Hummingbird. You're cleared for continued operations at pilot discretion. Godspeed." The 7th approach to the valley was the most terrifying yet. The tail rotor was making grinding noises that could be heard even over the engine and main rotor, and Maria had to fight constant yaw oscillations that threatened to send the helicopter spinning out of control. Enemy fire was now so intense that it sounded like hail on the aircraft skin, with rounds hitting the Hummingbird almost continuously during the descent and landing. 2 more casualties were loaded, a soldier with a severe head wound and another with burns and shrapnel wounds covering most of his body. Both men were barely clinging to life, kept stable only by the heroic efforts of medics, who were themselves wounded and running out of medical supplies. The takeoff during the 7th trip was when the tail rotor bearing finally began its terminal failure. Maria felt the pedal controls become mushy and unresponsive, felt the helicopter's nose swing unpredictably as the anti-torque system began to lose effectiveness. She compensated by using forward airspeed to maintain directional control, flying the helicopter more like an airplane than a rotorcraft, but she knew this was a temporary solution at best. They made it to the field hospital, delivered 2 more casualties to the trauma teams, and Maria finally allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might not be able to continue. 20 soldiers remained in the valley, but her helicopter was approaching the point of total mechanical failure. Each additional flight was now a roll of the dice with the lives of everyone aboard as the stakes. The maintenance chief didn't even bother with the formal inspection after the 7th trip. He could hear the tail rotor problems from 50 yards away, could see the way the helicopter yawed uncontrollably during hover operations. "Captain, this is it. I cannot allow this aircraft to fly again. You've pushed her beyond her limits, and she's given everything she has to give." Maria looked at her helicopter, seeing it truly for the first time since the mission began.
The small aircraft was riddled with bullet holes, leaking fluids from multiple damaged systems, and making noises that indicated critical mechanical failures throughout its structure. The Hummingbird had indeed given everything it had to give, had exceeded every design specification and performance limitation to bring wounded soldiers to safety. But there were still 20 men in that valley, and the radio reports indicated that several of them wouldn't survive much longer without immediate medical attention. The enemy forces were closing in, ammunition was running critically low, and time was rapidly running out for everyone involved. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career and the rest of her life. She would make one more trip, just one more, to evacuate the most critical casualties. If the helicopter survived that flight, she would reassess the situation. If it didn't, at least she would have tried to save as many lives as possible before the end. The 8th trip to the valley began with Maria Santos making peace with the possibility that she might not survive the next hour. The Hummingbird's tail rotor was grinding so badly that she could feel the vibrations through her seat, and the pedal controls had become so unresponsive that maintaining directional control required constant attention and physical effort. The engine temperature was climbing steadily into the red zone despite the emergency repairs, and hydraulic fluid was leaking so rapidly that she had maybe 30 minutes of power-assisted flight time remaining. But as she lifted off from the field hospital for what might be her final flight, Maria felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had already accomplished something that everyone, including herself, had thought impossible. 14 soldiers who had been trapped in that valley were now receiving life-saving medical treatment because she had been willing to fly a toy-sized helicopter into conditions that had defeated much larger, more heavily armed aircraft. The flight to the valley took place in an atmosphere of mounting tension that was palpable even over the radio. Intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese forces had moved heavy weapons into positions overlooking the American soldiers' location, and time estimates suggested the trapped platoon had maybe an hour before being completely overrun. The radio chatter from the ground was becoming increasingly desperate, with reports of ammunition running critically low and several wounded soldiers whose conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Hummingbird Ground Zero Actual, came the call as Maria approached the valley for the 8th time. Be advised, we have movement on all sides. Looks like Charlie is preparing for a final assault. We need immediate extraction for our critical cases, but the LZ is hotter than it's ever been. Maria keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the mechanical problems plaguing her aircraft. Ground Zero, Hummingbird inbound. Have your priority casualties ready for immediate loading. I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this. The descent into the valley during the 8th trip was like flying into the center of a hurricane made of bullets and explosions. The enemy fire was so intense that tracer rounds created visible walls of light through which she had to navigate her damaged helicopter. The sound was indescribable, a combination of her struggling engine, the grinding tail rotor, and the constant metallic impacts of rounds striking her aircraft. Halfway down through the canopy, the tail rotor bearing finally seized completely. Maria felt the helicopter immediately begin to spin as the anti-torque system failed, the aircraft rotating faster and faster as she fought to maintain control through forward airspeed and collective pitch adjustments. Only her years of experience and lightning-fast reflexes prevented the Hummingbird from spinning directly into the surrounding trees. She managed to arrest the spin through a combination of engine power manipulation and cyclic control inputs that pushed both pilot and machine to their absolute limits. The helicopter hit the clearing hard, bounced twice, and settled with a grinding crash that told her the landing gear had sustained significant damage. But they were down, they were alive, and wounded soldiers were already moving toward her aircraft. The casualties loaded during the 8th trip were the most severely wounded yet. One soldier had lost consciousness from blood loss and was being kept alive only through the constant efforts of a medic who himself was wounded. Another casualty had sustained massive trauma to his abdomen and was in critical condition that required immediate surgical intervention. Both men were loaded into the helicopter's cramped cabin along with a medic who volunteered to accompany them despite knowing that the aircraft might not survive the flight to the hospital. The takeoff attempt from the clearing during the 8th trip nearly ended in disaster. With the tail rotor completely failed, Maria had to use a technique called a running takeoff, building forward airspeed while still on the ground until she had enough translational lift to become airborne despite the loss of anti-torque control. The procedure required precise timing, perfect conditions, and a large measure of luck. She had none of those advantages. The clearing was too small for a proper running takeoff, the aircraft was overloaded with casualties and medical personnel, and enemy fire was now so concentrated that rounds were hitting the helicopter continuously. But Maria managed to coax the Hummingbird into the air through sheer force of will and flying skills that bordered on the supernatural. The flight to the field hospital with a completely failed tail rotor system was an exercise in controlled flight on the edge of disaster. Maria had to maintain constant forward airspeed to keep the helicopter directionally stable, could never slow down or hover, and had to plan her approach to the hospital landing pad with the precision of a military operation. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the aircraft would spin out of control and crash. But they made it. The Hummingbird touched down at the field hospital, hard but intact. The 2 critical casualties were rushed into surgery, and Maria finally allowed herself a moment to assess the true condition of her aircraft. What she saw was both heartbreaking and inspiring. A small helicopter that had given everything it had to give in service of saving American lives. 18 soldiers remained in the valley, and Maria's helicopter was no longer capable of flight.
The silence that followed the shutdown of the Hummingbird's engine was almost as dramatic as the sound of combat had been. For nearly 8 hours, the small helicopter had been Maria's constant companion, its engine noise and rotor beat providing the soundtrack to the most intense flying she had ever experienced. Now, with critical systems failed throughout the aircraft, the silence felt like the end of an era. The maintenance chief didn't need to conduct a formal inspection to render his verdict. The tail rotor system was completely destroyed, the engine was overheating beyond safe limits, the hydraulic system had failed catastrophically, and the airframe had sustained so much battle damage that major structural components were compromised. The Hummingbird had flown its last mission. "Captain, I'm sorry," the maintenance chief said, his voice heavy with respect and regret. "She's done everything anyone could ask of her, but there's nothing more we can do. This bird will never fly again without a complete rebuild from the ground up." Maria stood beside her helicopter, running her hand along the bullet-scarred fuselage, feeling the warm metal that had carried her and 34 wounded soldiers through impossible conditions. The Hummingbird looked small and fragile, sitting on the landing pad, its battle damage clearly visible in the harsh hospital lights. But appearances could be deceiving. This toy-sized helicopter had just completed one of the most remarkable rescue missions in aviation history. The radio in the nearby operations tent crackled with increasingly desperate calls from the soldiers still trapped in the valley. 18 men, including several in critical condition, still needed evacuation. The enemy forces were closing in, ammunition was nearly exhausted, and time was running out for everyone involved. "We need alternatives," Colonel Morrison announced during an emergency command conference that Maria was invited to attend. "The Hummingbird is down, our standard Huey medevacs can't get into that LZ, and we're looking at the possibility of losing 18 more soldiers if we can't find a solution." The conference room was filled with the tension that comes with impossible decisions and limited options. Various alternatives were discussed: ground evacuation through hostile territory, airstrikes to drive back enemy forces, even the possibility of writing off the trapped soldiers as casualties of war. None of the options were good, and all of them involved significant risks and probable additional casualties. "What about using multiple OH-6As?" suggested the aviation operations officer. "If Captain Santos proved that one Loach can get in and out of that LZ, maybe we could use several aircraft to complete the evacuation more quickly." "Negative," replied the intelligence officer. "We only have 2 other OH-6As in this area of operations, and both are committed to critical reconnaissance missions. Besides, the enemy forces have had 8 hours to study Captain Santos's approach patterns and adjust their defensive positions. What worked this morning might be suicide this afternoon."
Maria listened to the discussion with growing frustration. The focus seemed to be shifting from how to save the remaining soldiers to how to minimize additional losses while accepting that some men would be left behind. That was not acceptable. Not to her, not to the oath she had taken, and not to the soldiers who were counting on someone to keep trying until every last man was brought home. "Sir, I'm sorry," she interrupted, causing the room to fall silent. "Request permission to inspect the other OH-6As on base. Maybe we can cannibalize parts from my aircraft to get one of them airworthy for the mission." Colonel Morrison looked skeptical. "Captain, even if we could make another Loach flyable, you've been flying combat missions for 8 hours straight. You're exhausted, you're operating on adrenaline and caffeine, and you've already pushed your luck beyond any reasonable limits. We need to find another pilot for any additional missions." "With respect, sir, I'm the only pilot who's been in and out of that LZ. I know the approach patterns, the enemy positions, the timing required for successful operations. Any other pilot would be going in blind, which would be more dangerous for everyone involved." The debate that followed was heated, but brief. Military doctrines suggested that Maria should be relieved of duty for her own safety and the safety of future missions. But military reality acknowledged that she was the only person who had demonstrated the ability to successfully operate in the conditions present in that valley. While the debate continued, Maria excused herself to examine the other OH-6A helicopters on the base. What she found was both promising and problematic. One aircraft was in excellent mechanical condition, but was configured for reconnaissance rather than medevac operations. The other helicopter had the right equipment for casualty evacuation, but had been grounded for engine problems that seemed repairable given enough time and spare parts. The solution, when it came to her, was so simple and so obvious that she wondered why no one had thought of it before. Instead of trying to repair one helicopter completely, they could combine the best components from multiple aircraft to create one flyable machine capable of completing the mission. "It's called cross-cannibalization," she explained to the maintenance chief. "We take the good engine from the recon bird, the working tail rotor from my aircraft, and the medevac equipment from the grounded helicopter. It won't be pretty, and it won't be by the book, but it might work." The maintenance chief looked thoughtful. "How long do you think we have before those soldiers are overrun?" Maria checked her watch and calculated based on the most recent intelligence reports. "Maybe 2 hours? 3 on the outside. Then we better get started."
The next 90 minutes were a blur of frantic activity as maintenance crews worked to create a flyable helicopter from the components of 3 different aircraft. It was emergency field maintenance taken to an extreme that would have horrified peacetime safety inspectors, but was exactly the kind of innovative problem-solving that had kept military aircraft flying throughout the history of warfare. The engine swap was the most complex part of the operation, requiring the removal of perfectly good power plants from 2 different helicopters and the installation of the best unit into the aircraft that had the most flyable airframe. Hydraulic lines had to be rerouted, electrical connections had to be modified, and control systems had to be adjusted to accommodate components that had never been designed to work together. While the maintenance crews worked on the mechanical systems, Maria found herself dealing with a different kind of problem. Word of her ongoing rescue mission had spread throughout the combat zone, and she was receiving radio calls from commanders at every level, wanting updates on the situation. Some were offering support and encouragement, but others were expressing concerns about the risks being taken and the resources being expended for what some considered an impossible mission. "Hummingbird, this is General Patterson, Corps Aviation," came one particularly pointed radio call. "Captain Santos, I'm hearing reports that you're attempting to continue rescue operations with an aircraft that's been jerry-rigged from spare parts. Is that accurate?" Maria keyed her microphone carefully, knowing that her response could determine whether she would be allowed to continue the mission or ordered to stand down. "General, we're conducting emergency field maintenance to restore one OH-6A to flyable condition using components from multiple aircraft. The work is being supervised by qualified maintenance personnel and will be completed to the highest standards possible given time and resource constraints." "Captain,
I admire your dedication, but I have to consider the larger picture here. We've already invested significant resources in this rescue operation, and continuing to throw good money after bad might not be the wisest course of action. Maria felt a surge of anger that she carefully controlled before responding. Sir, with respect, we're not talking about money or resources. We're talking about 18 American soldiers who are counting on us not to give up on them. Every man we've evacuated so far has survived because someone was willing to take risks and push limits. I'm asking for permission to continue that effort. There was a long pause on the radio. When General Patterson's voice returned, it carried a tone of resignation. Very well, Captain. You're authorized to continue operations at local commander discretion, but I want real-time updates on your status, and if this jerry-rigged aircraft shows any signs of mechanical problems, you are ordered to abort immediately. Roger, General. Understood. The cobbled-together helicopter that emerged from the maintenance hangar looked like exactly what it was, a patchwork of components from multiple aircraft held together by skill, determination, and a large amount of prayer. The engine was from one helicopter, the tail rotor from another, and the cabin configuration from a third. Nothing matched properly, there were temporary fixes and field modifications throughout the aircraft, and the whole contraption looked like it had been assembled by someone with more enthusiasm than engineering expertise. But it would fly. The engine ran smoothly, the rotor systems were balanced and functional, and all the critical flight systems were operational. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't orthodox, and it certainly wasn't something that would pass a formal inspection, but it was an aircraft capable of reaching the valley and bringing back wounded soldiers. Maria completed her pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness of someone who knew her life depended on catching any problems before they became catastrophic failures. Every system was checked, every connection was tested, and every component was evaluated for its reliability under the extreme conditions she would soon face. The maintenance chief, who had supervised the aircraft reconstruction, stood beside her as she prepared for takeoff. Captain, this bird will fly, but I can't guarantee for how long. We've pushed maintenance procedures beyond anything in the manuals, and we're operating in uncharted territory. If you feel anything unusual, anything at all, you need to land immediately. Understood, Chief. How many trips do you think she's good for? The maintenance chief considered this question carefully. Maybe 3, maybe 5. Could be just 1 if we got something wrong. There's no way to predict how these cobbled-together systems will hold up under combat conditions. Maria nodded and climbed into the pilot's seat of her improvised helicopter. 18 soldiers were still waiting in that valley, and she had perhaps 3 flights to bring them all home. It would require perfect execution, extraordinary luck, and a continuation of the flying skills that had already pushed her beyond what anyone thought was possible. But as she started the engine and felt the familiar vibration of rotor blades beating against humid air, Maria Santos knew she would keep flying until every last soldier was safe or until her aircraft could no longer leave the ground.
The 9th trip to the valley took place in an atmosphere of mounting desperation that was evident even in the radio communications. The enemy forces had moved heavy weapons into positions that covered all approaches to the American positions, and the trapped soldiers were reporting that they were down to their last magazines of ammunition. Intelligence estimates suggested that the final enemy assault would begin within the hour, and if the remaining casualties weren't evacuated before that happened, rescue would become impossible. Maria's cobbled-together helicopter flew differently than any aircraft she had ever piloted. The engine responses were slightly delayed, the rotor system had a different harmonic frequency than she was accustomed to, and the control inputs required constant adjustment to maintain stable flight. But it flew, and that was all that mattered. Hummingbird, Ground Zero Actual, came the radio call as she approached the valley. Thank God you're back. We thought maybe... Never mind. We have 2 priority casualties that won't last much longer, and enemy movement indicates they're preparing for a final push. This might be our last chance. Ground Zero, Hummingbird copies. I'll be making multiple trips until everyone is out. Just keep marking targets for me and keep those casualties ready for immediate loading. The descent into the valley during the 9th trip revealed how dramatically the tactical situation had deteriorated during her absence.
Enemy tracer fire was now coming from positions that had been unoccupied during her earlier flights, indicating that reinforcements had arrived in significant numbers. The volume of incoming fire was so intense that it sounded like a constant drumbeat against her aircraft's skin. But the improvised helicopter held together, responding to her control inputs despite the obvious stress being placed on systems that had never been designed to work together. 2 more critical casualties were loaded aboard, soldiers whose wounds were so severe that the medics weren't optimistic about their chances of survival, even with immediate surgical intervention. The flight back to the field hospital was tense, but successful, with both casualties being rushed into surgery as soon as the aircraft touched down. 16 soldiers remained in the valley, and Maria was beginning to believe that she might actually be able to complete the impossible mission she had begun so many hours ago. The 10th trip revealed new problems with her improvised aircraft. The engine temperature was climbing steadily, indicating that the cooling system modifications weren't entirely successful. The makeshift hydraulic connections were showing signs of stress, with small leaks appearing at several connection points. And most concerning, the tail rotor was beginning to make noises that suggested the bearings were wearing rapidly under the strain of repeated combat operations. But the helicopter continued to fly, continued to respond to her commands, continued to carry wounded soldiers to safety. 2 more casualties evacuated, 14 remaining, and Maria was starting to believe that victory was actually possible. The 11th trip took place as enemy artillery began falling near the trapped American positions, indicating that the final assault was imminent. The radio calls from the ground were becoming increasingly urgent, with reports that enemy forces were moving to positions that would make any further helicopter operations impossible. Hummingbird, Ground Zero actual. The voice on the radio was tight with controlled panic. We've got incoming artillery, multiple enemy squads moving to assault positions, and maybe 10 minutes before this place becomes untenable. We need immediate extraction for our remaining casualties. Maria pushed her damaged helicopter to its limits during the 11th approach, diving through the canopy at speeds that threatened to tear the aircraft apart while enemy fire concentrated on her position with deadly intensity. The improvised helicopter shuddered under the stress but held together, delivering her to the clearing where 2 more wounded soldiers were loaded aboard with desperate efficiency. 12 casualties remaining, and time was running out for everyone involved. The 12th trip began with clear signs that the improvised helicopter was reaching the limits of its endurance. The engine was overheating badly enough that Maria could smell burning oil. The hydraulic system was losing pressure rapidly, and the tail rotor bearings were making grinding noises that indicated imminent failure. But 12 soldiers were still trapped in that valley, and she would keep flying until either all of them were safe or her aircraft could no longer leave the ground. As she approached the valley for what might be the final time, Maria could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons that were now positioned almost within the clearing itself. The American soldiers had been forced back into defensive positions that offered minimal cover, and it was obvious that they were fighting for their lives with whatever ammunition they had remaining. The landing during the 12th trip was accomplished under the most intense enemy fire she had yet encountered. Rounds were striking her helicopter continuously, and she could hear the distinctive sounds of critical systems being damaged by incoming bullets. But 2 more casualties were loaded aboard, and the improvised aircraft struggled back into the air despite damage that would have grounded any reasonable aircraft hours ago. 10 soldiers remained in the valley, the enemy assault was beginning, and Maria's helicopter was barely capable of flight. But she had come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now. As long as the aircraft would respond to her controls, she would keep going back.
The 13th trip to the valley began with the knowledge that it might be impossible to complete. Maria's improvised helicopter was now operating entirely on backup systems and pilot determination, with primary flight controls compromised, engine temperature in the red zone, and mechanical noises throughout the airframe that indicated multiple critical failures. But 10 American soldiers were still trapped in that clearing, and the enemy assault had begun in earnest. The radio chatter from the ground painted a picture of desperate men fighting against overwhelming odds. Hummingbird, Ground Zero actual, we're taking heavy casualties. Enemy forces are inside our perimeter. We need immediate extraction for our remaining wounded, but I don't know how much longer we can hold the LZ. Maria could hear the sound of small arms fire and explosions in the background of the radio transmission, could hear the desperation in the ground commander's voice. The final battle for the valley was underway, and time had run out for elaborate planning or careful approaches. This would be a matter of flying straight into the heart of a firefight and hoping that skill, luck, and mechanical systems held together long enough to save a few more lives. The descent during the 13th trip was like flying into hell itself. Enemy tracer fire filled the air so densely that it looked like deadly fireworks, and the sound of rounds hitting her aircraft was now constant rather than intermittent. The helicopter was taking damage faster than it could be assessed, with systems failing in rapid succession as bullets found critical components. Halfway down through the canopy, the engine began to seize. Maria felt the power drop suddenly, heard the grinding noise of internal components destroying themselves, and realized that her improvised aircraft had finally reached the limits of its endurance. But she was committed to the approach now, with insufficient altitude and airspeed to abort safely, and 10 wounded soldiers counting on her arrival. She auto-rotated the helicopter down through the remaining tree cover, using gravity and stored rotor energy to maintain controlled flight without engine power. It was an advanced flying technique that required perfect timing and precise control inputs, made exponentially more difficult by enemy fire, mechanical failures, and the confined space of the jungle clearing. The landing was more controlled crash than graceful touchdown. The helicopter hit the ground hard enough to crack the landing gear, bounced twice, and settled with a grinding noise that told Maria her aircraft would never fly again. But they were down, they were alive, and wounded soldiers were already moving toward the helicopter despite the intense enemy fire. "2 more," shouted the medic who appeared at her aircraft door. "Critical chest wound and severe burns. But Captain, this LZ is about to be overrun. You need to get out of here now." Maria looked around the clearing as the casualties were loaded, seeing enemy muzzle flashes that were now close enough to illuminate individual soldiers moving through the jungle shadows. The American defensive perimeter had collapsed to the point where friendly and enemy forces were intermingled, fighting at close range with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. The takeoff attempt with the seized engine was an exercise in aerodynamic impossibility. Without power, the helicopter could not maintain controlled flight, but Maria managed to use the brief momentum from her landing roll to build enough rotor speed for one final, desperate leap into the air. The aircraft cleared the treetops by mere feet, glided for perhaps half a mile on stored energy, and then settled into another clearing with a crash that completed the destruction of the landing gear and damaged the main rotor system beyond repair. But they had made it out of the immediate combat zone. The 2 casualties were alive, and a ground rescue team was already moving toward their position to provide medical assistance and transportation back to the field hospital. 8 soldiers remained in the original clearing, now completely cut off by enemy forces that had overrun the American positions.
Maria Santos stood beside the wreckage of her second helicopter in less than 12 hours, watching smoke rise from the valley where 8 American soldiers were making their final stand against overwhelming enemy forces. Her flying career, at least in terms of this mission, was over. There were no more aircraft available, no more spare parts to cannibalize, and no more mechanical miracles that could put her back in the air. But as she listened to the radio reports from the trapped soldiers, Maria realized that her work was not yet finished. The 8 men still in the valley were not just names on a casualty report. They were soldiers who had fought bravely, who had trusted in the promise that no American would be left behind, and who deserved every effort that could be made to bring them home. "Ground Zero Actual, this is Hummingbird," she called on her portable radio. "My aircraft is down, but I'm organizing a ground rescue operation. What's your current tactical situation?" "Hummingbird, we're surrounded and running out of ammunition. 5 wounded who can't move without assistance, 3 walking wounded who are still fighting. Enemy forces are preparing for what looks like a final assault. We've got maybe 30 minutes before they overrun our position completely." 30 minutes.
Maria looked around at the resources available to her: a crashed helicopter, a small rescue team that had been sent to recover her crew, and the determination of soldiers who refused to abandon their comrades. It wasn't much, but it was what she had to work with. What happened next became the subject of military legend and countless after-action reports. Maria organized the available personnel into an improvised rescue force, using her knowledge of the terrain and enemy positions to plan an approach that might, just might, reach the trapped soldiers before they were overrun. The ground rescue operation was launched immediately, with Maria leading a team of volunteers through jungle terrain toward the sounds of gunfire that marked the location of the final battle. They moved quickly but carefully, knowing that speed was essential, but that walking into an ambush would help no one. The rescue itself was a close-quarters battle fought with small arms, grenades, and the desperate courage of soldiers who refused to leave their comrades behind. Maria and her team reached the trapped soldiers just as the final enemy assault began, and for 20 minutes the jungle clearing was the scene of the most intense fighting any of them had ever experienced. When the shooting finally stopped, all of the 8 of the remaining soldiers had been evacuated from the valley. Some were carried on improvised stretchers. Others were helped along by comrades who were themselves wounded, but all of them were alive and moving toward the field hospital where trauma teams were waiting to provide life-saving medical care. The final count, when all the numbers were tallied, was remarkable by any standard. 34 American soldiers had been trapped in an impossible tactical situation, surrounded by enemy forces in terrain that made conventional rescue operations impossible. Maria Santos, flying a helicopter that other pilots had dismissed as a toy, had evacuated every single one of them. 14 casualties were evacuated by air in the initial series of flights using her original OH-6A helicopter. Another 12 soldiers were brought out during the second phase of operations using the improvised aircraft cobbled together from spare parts. The final 8 soldiers were rescued during the ground operation that Maria organized and led after her aircraft were no longer flyable. The mission had taken nearly 14 hours to complete, had required flying skills that pushed both pilot and machine beyond their design limits, and had demonstrated that determination and courage could sometimes overcome impossible odds. More importantly, it had proven that the military's promise to leave no one behind was more than just words. It was a commitment that would be honored regardless of the cost or the risk involved. Maria Santos was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during the rescue operation, but she always insisted that the real heroes were the soldiers who had fought to defend their wounded comrades and the maintenance crews who had worked miracles to keep damaged aircraft flying. In her mind, she had simply done what any pilot would have done in the same situation. She had flown until every American soldier was safe. The story of the toy-sized helicopter that evacuated 34 wounded soldiers from a hot zone became part of military aviation legend, told and retold in flight schools and pilot training programs as an example of what could be accomplished when skill, determination, and courage combined with the right aircraft in the right hands. But to those who were there, who lived through those 14 hours of impossible flying and desperate fighting, it was simply the day that Maria Santos proved that size doesn't matter when measured against the human spirit. Years later, when asked about the mission that had defined her military career, Maria Santos would always say the same thing. They called my helicopter toy-sized until it brought their friends home. After that, nobody ever questioned what the hummingbird could do. The 34 soldiers who returned from that valley would agree. In their minds, there was nothing toy-sized about the aircraft or the pilot who had refused to abandon them when the situation seemed hopeless. To them, both the aircraft and Captain Maria Santos were exactly the right size for heroes.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.